Today's story is about a man whose face sent shockwaves across America the moment it appeared on TV. His name was Paul Stephen Mack, a man who lived behind lies, false identities, and carefully crafted charm. To everyone around him, he appeared gentle, loving, stable. But beneath that mask was one of America's most wanted fugitives, hiding in plain sight. But the most unbelievable part of this case isn't just his crimes. It's the way his secret life was exposed. His new wife discovered the truth about him not through rumors, not through police, not through some suspicious behavior, but while watching television in the safety of her own living room. Imagine this for a moment. You're sitting on the couch next to your husband, the man you trust, the man you've built a life with, the man you believe you truly know. The TV is on in the background. Then suddenly, a segment from America's Most Wanted begins. A wanted criminal's face appears on the screen. A name you've never heard. But the face looks exactly like the man sitting right beside you. At first, your brain tells you it can't be real. It must be a coincidence. But the more you look, the more your heart sinks. The jawline, the eyes, the voice in the reenactment, it all matches. And in that moment you realize the horrifying possibility. You may be married to a man living a double life, a man who has lied about everything, a man who might be dangerous. For years, Paul Stephen Mack slipped through the cracks of the system. He moved from state to state, constantly reinventing himself. New names, new marriages, new stories, each one carefully designed to hide the truth. And behind every fake identity, there was another victim, another life damaged, another lie waiting to unfold. But his web of deception didn't last forever. Because on that ordinary night, on that ordinary couch, his wife finally saw the truth on national television. And that one moment would unravel his entire secret life. In this video, we're going to uncover who Paul Stephen Mack really was, how he manipulated the people around him, how his wife recognized him on TV, how investigators tracked him down, and how the truth finally caught up with one of America's most wanted fugitives. Get ready, because the truth about Paul Stephen Mack is far darker than anyone expected. Paul Stephen Mack's story doesn't begin with the sensational headlines, the TV broadcasts, or the chilling revelations that later made him infamous. His story starts much earlier, long before he became a wanted fugitive, long before he began manipulating women and building fake identities. To understand how he evolved into one of America's deceptive predators, we have to look back at his early life, the conditions that shaped him, and the first signs that something was terribly wrong. Paul was born in the mid-1950s in the United States, raised in a family environment that, on the surface, didn't seem unusually chaotic. But beneath that outward normalcy, there were deep-rooted problems, instability, unresolved family tensions, and a lack of emotional structure. People who later dug into his past described his childhood as disconnected, marked by constant changes in behavior, and an early tendency to manipulate situations to get what he wanted. Even as a child, Paul had a talent for charming adults when necessary, then turning cold and distant when he didn't get his way. This dual personality, charming on the outside, calculating underneath, became the defining pattern of his life. During his teenage years, Paul's behavior escalated. He began experimenting with small lies, skipping school, stealing minor items, and blaming others whenever he got caught. He quickly learned that lies could solve problems faster than taking responsibility. Instead of guilt, he felt emboldened. Manipulation became a skill for him, a tool, not a symptom. By the time Paul reached his early adulthood, the patterns were firmly set. He struggled to maintain steady work, moved frequently, and never formed long-term friendships. He seemed to float through life without attachments, and whenever someone got too close or noticed inconsistencies in his stories, he simply cut ties and vanished. People who later described him often used the same phrases. He seemed normal. He was friendly. Nothing felt off at first. That was the terrifying part, how ordinary he appeared. Paul's earliest documented crimes involved fraud, identity theft, and manipulation. He used fake names, forged documents, and fabricated backstories to enter new towns and workplaces. He claimed to be different things depending on the situation: a military veteran, a hard-working laborer, a college graduate, a widower. None of it was true. His lies were crafted with precision, designed to earn sympathy or trust, depending on what he needed. And the people who trusted him became stepping stones for his next escape. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, Paul drifted from state to state, committing small-scale crimes that often went undetected or unreported. The justice system at the time wasn't equipped to track individuals who moved frequently, changed identities, or operated under multiple aliases. That loophole became Paul's safe zone. Every new city was a reset button for him. New life, new neighbors, new victims. It was during this period that Paul began targeting women more aggressively. He learned how to study their weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and emotional needs. Some were lonely. Some were recently divorced. Some just wanted stability. Paul molded himself into whatever version of a partner they wanted. He mimicked empathy, affection, and devotion. But it was all an act. This was also when signs of deeper psychological issues became evident. He displayed controlling behavior, jealousy, and emotional manipulation. Victims later described him as a man who could switch personalities in seconds, loving one moment, threatening the next. He isolated his partners, kept them away from family and friends, and created an environment where they were dependent on him. Once he gained control, he used it to exploit them emotionally, financially, and in some cases, physically. The red flags were there early: his lies, his disappearing acts, his lack of empathy, but no one connected the dots. Every time a situation became too risky for him, Paul simply reinvented himself. And with no digital records, no online databases, and no way for states to share information efficiently, Paul Stephen Mack perfected the art of slipping through the cracks. His early life wasn't just a background. It was the blueprint of the man he eventually became: a master manipulator, a pathological liar, and a predator who learned from a very young age that deception was his greatest weapon. As Paul Stephen Mack moved deeper into adulthood, his ability to reinvent himself became almost disturbingly flawless. He didn't just change names, he changed entire lives. Wherever he went, he became a different man, tailored to whatever story worked best in that moment. This skill, combined with his charm and emotional intelligence, turned him into a predator who could blend into any environment and target women with chilling precision. Paul used dozens of aliases throughout his life, and each one was crafted with intention. He forged new documents, adjusted birth dates, fabricated work histories, and sometimes adopted small personality traits that made the lie feel more real. Under one name, he might claim to be a construction worker. Under another, a traveling salesman. In one town, he was a quiet, soft-spoken man who kept to himself. In another, he presented himself as a confident, outgoing romantic partner. His identity shifted depending on what he needed from the people around him, but behind every carefully curated persona was a strategy, one centered around targeting vulnerable women. Paul's method for selecting victims was not impulsive, it was calculated. He observed women closely. He watched how they interacted with others, how they carried themselves, what emotional gaps they had in their lives. Many of his victims were women who had recently left toxic relationships, gone through divorces, or experienced emotional hardship. These women were not weak. They were human. And Paul understood exactly how to exploit vulnerability. He started by presenting himself as the perfect listener. He asked questions that made women feel understood, validated, and seen. He memorized personal details and repeated them back at just the right moments, giving an illusion of deep emotional connection. He could mirror someone's personality almost perfectly, a skill often seen in pathological manipulators. If a woman loved travel, he suddenly became adventurous. If she admired stability, he became the dependable, hard-working man. If she valued kindness, he exaggerated empathy and gentleness. This mirroring technique built trust quickly, too quickly. Women felt as though they had found someone who truly got them, someone who understood their traumas, their hopes, their fears, someone who seemed safe. Once Paul established that connection, he subtly began isolating them. He made them feel like he was the only person who genuinely cared about them, gradually pushing family and friends to the side. He created emotional dependence, making them believe that losing him would be devastating. Then the control began. Paul used guilt, manipulation, and small threats disguised as concern. He questioned where they were going, who they were talking to, and why they were making certain decisions. At first, it seemed like protectiveness. Over time, it became suffocating. And once he had full control, he exploited them, emotionally, financially, and in some cases, physically. Many victims later described the same pattern. Paul seemed too perfect at first, too understanding, too eager to help. It was only after months or even years that they began noticing inconsistencies, stories that didn't line up, missing documents, sudden disappearances, unexplained anger. But questioning him was dangerous. Whenever his lies were at risk of unraveling, Paul didn't try to fix them. He ran. He disappeared overnight and reappeared in another state under a brand new identity. New name, new backstory, new relationship. His victims were left confused, heartbroken, sometimes terrified, and they had no idea who he really was. The lack of national databases at the time worked in his favor. Without modern digital tracking systems, it was almost impossible to spot patterns across state lines. Police departments didn't always communicate with each other, and background checks were limited. As long as Paul moved frequently and hid behind new documents, he remained invisible to the system. Paul perfected the art of blending in. He attended community events, joined local churches, volunteered in neighborhood activities, and even helped neighbors with small tasks. He looked like the last person anyone would suspect, a friendly, ordinary man who seemed eager to build a life wherever he went. But behind that mask was a man who saw relationships as tools, identities as costumes, and lies as weapons. His victims were not chosen by accident. They were targeted with intention, studied carefully, and manipulated with frightening skill. By the time authorities finally began connecting the dots, Paul Stephen Mack had already shattered multiple lives and reinvented himself more times than anyone could count. His ability to disappear, reappear, and charm his way into new relationships made him one of the most dangerous types of predators, the kind you never see coming. When Paul Stephen Mack met the woman who would later expose his secret life, he appeared, just as he always did, to be the perfect partner. He entered her life at a moment when she needed stability and kindness, and he knew exactly how to provide both. He showed up as a gentle, attentive man who listened closely, spoke softly, and made her feel safe. For a woman who had weathered emotional storms in her past, Paul felt like a blessing, like the fresh start she had always hoped for. He didn't rush the relationship. Instead, he played the long game, slowly easing into her world, winning her trust piece by piece. Her family liked him. Her friends described him as polite and respectful. He offered to help with anything she needed: car repairs, errands, small household tasks. He made himself indispensable. And soon, he became part of her daily life, her routines, her comfort. When he proposed marriage, she said yes without hesitation. By then, Paul had already built a facade strong enough to hide behind. He acted like a man ready for commitment, stability, and a future. Their wedding wasn't extravagant, but it felt meaningful. Two people starting a new chapter together. But something was always slightly off. Little details didn't line up, a story that changed between conversations, an ID he never fully showed, a sudden shift in mood when she asked personal questions. He would deflect, redirect, or act hurt by her curiosity. She dismissed her doubts, believing that everyone has a past, and that trust requires patience. She convinced herself it was normal. What she didn't know was that she had married a man who had perfected the art of hiding. Months into the marriage, their routine was simple. Dinners at home, evening conversations, and TV in the background. Paul liked to keep the remote in his hand, often flipping channels quickly whenever news stories or crime segments came on. She noticed, but she didn't think much of it. One night, everything changed. It started like any other evening. Dinner, small talk, the soft hum of a TV show playing in the background. Paul seemed unusually quiet, but she brushed it off. As she put dishes away, she heard a familiar tune, the theme music of America's Most Wanted. Paul stiffened. She didn't catch it at first, but when she looked at him, she noticed his posture had gone rigid, his breathing tight. Without saying a word, he tried casually reaching for the remote. Too casually. "Leave it," she said. "I want to watch this." He forced a smile. "It's just depressing. Let's watch something else." But she insisted. Something in her gut whispered that she needed to pay attention. The host began describing a fugitive on the run. A man with a history of manipulation, violence, and multiple identities. A man authorities had been desperately trying to track down. Then the screen shifted to a sketch. She froze. The jawline, the eyes, the shape of the face. It was Paul. For a moment, her brain refused to accept it. She told herself it couldn't be real. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe the sketch just looked similar. But then the show cut to old photographs, grainy but clear enough. Photos of the same man who had married her. The same voice pattern, the same mannerisms. It was undeniable. Her heart began pounding. She felt a wave of nausea, fear, confusion. She looked at Paul. His face had gone pale, his hands slightly trembling. He knew she knew. "What is this?" she whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, pacing, panicking, searching for a lie convincing enough to save him. But there was no lie strong enough anymore. The mask had fallen. Overwhelmed and terrified, she locked herself in the bathroom, shaking, listening to him move back and forth down the hallway, unsure whether he would flee, get violent, or try to manipulate her again. That night became the turning point, the moment a loving marriage transformed into a nightmare of truth. It was the night she realized the man she married wasn't who he claimed to be. He wasn't a loving husband. He wasn't even the person on his ID. He was a fugitive, a predator, a man running from a past too dark to hide forever. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The night Paul, Stephen Mack's wife, recognized him on television wasn't just a personal revelation. It became the spark that pushed a long-stalled investigation forward. For years, authorities across multiple states had scattered pieces of information on Mack. Some had reports of abuse, others had cases of fraud, and a few had evidence tied to far more serious crimes. But none of them had enough to fully connect the dots. Mack thrived in those gaps. After that night, everything began changing. His wife, shaken and terrified, made one of the hardest decisions of her life. She contacted authorities. Her voice trembled as she explained what she had seen, how the man she married resembled the fugitive featured on national television. She wasn't fully certain, but her fear was real, and it was enough to prompt investigators to reopen dusty case files, cross-reference old aliases, and begin piecing together the truth about the man who had slipped through the cracks for nearly 2 decades. As investigators dug deeper, a chilling pattern started emerging. Women from different states, California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, had all come forward with complaints about a man who used different names but displayed the same violent, controlling behaviors. Some had filed restraining orders. Others had reported stalking, threats, and physical assault. A few had tried to alert police years earlier, but without technology or interstate communication systems, their warnings vanished into bureaucratic silence. But now, because of one courageous phone call, the stories finally began merging. Victims who had once felt ignored or dismissed now found investigators knocking on their doors. Some women broke down in tears as they recounted how Mack had isolated them, controlled their finances, monitored their movements, and emotionally imprisoned them. Others described sudden disappearances, how he would vanish overnight, leaving behind unpaid bills, fake paperwork, and a ruined life. And some told far darker stories, threats with weapons, violent outbursts, and chilling moments where they believed he might kill them. The testimonies painted the picture of a man who didn't just manipulate. He hunted. Investigators also discovered Mack's long list of aliases. Every fake name corresponded to a new town, a new job, or a new marriage. His identity trail resembled a spider web stretching across the U.S. Each thread led to a victim, a lie, or a crime left unresolved. Detectives found forged IDs, doctored social security numbers, and fake employment histories. Mack had become an expert at forging documents long before the digital age. He knew how to create paperwork convincing enough to fool employers, landlords, and even small-town police departments. As police closed in, Mack sensed the pressure. His behavior changed. He became more paranoid, more unpredictable. Neighbors noticed he was constantly watching through windows, jumping at sudden noises, and avoiding community interactions he once used as a disguise. He stopped using his real voice on phone calls. He avoided leaving behind written signatures, and he prepared for what he knew best: running. Mack tried to flee several times. Each move followed the same familiar pattern: disappearing quickly, abandoning belongings, and resurfacing in another state under a new identity. He picked remote areas, small towns, and cash-only environments. For a while, it worked. The lack of nationwide communication allowed him to outrun suspicion. But this time, he was not running from a single victim or a small-town police report. He was running from a multi-state investigation backed by a national broadcast that had exposed his face to millions. Investigators traced old addresses, followed leads from former partners, and gathered evidence from storage units he once rented. They even found handwritten notes, practice signatures for new identities, drafts of fake backstories, and lists of items he needed to maintain disguises. This wasn't a man who panicked his way through life. This was a man who planned every escape with precision. But no matter how many times he fled, the walls continued closing in. What finally broke the case open wasn't just police work. It was the courage of the women he had hurt. Their testimonies aligned perfectly, each one confirming a detail from another. Their stories overlapped in ways Mack could no longer outrun. For the first time, authorities had a timeline, witnesses, evidence, and most importantly, a real name tied to a real identity: Paul Stephen. Mack was no longer a ghost moving from state to state. He was a target, a hunted man, and this time running wouldn't save him. After years of slipping through cracks, using fake identities, charming his way into new lives, and running from state to state, Paul Stephen Mack's final chapter began the moment law enforcement gathered enough evidence to track him with precision. Unlike previous attempts where individual departments acted alone, this time multiple agencies, victims, and investigators were aligned, and that unity became the force Mack could no longer outrun. Authorities developed a timeline of his movements, matching aliases to job records, rental agreements, and witness statements. They created a profile of his habits, how he chose communities, how he blended in, and what signals he showed before preparing to flee. For the first time, investigators understood Paul Mack's pattern well enough to predict his next move. Their prediction was accurate. Mack had relocated to a quiet, unassuming town. To neighbors, he appeared friendly but private, helpful when approached, yet never revealing much about himself. He lived simply, used cash, and avoided attention. But the closer police got, the more his paranoia grew. He began minimizing contact with locals, taking unusual routes home, and avoiding any location with cameras. He knew something was wrong. He felt watched. But what he didn't know was that authorities had already located him. One early morning, before sunrise, police units surrounded the small house he had been renting under yet another fake name. The neighborhood was silent, unaware that one of America's most wanted fugitives was inside. Officers moved in carefully. They knocked, called out his name, his real name, and waited. Mack didn't answer. He tried to escape through a back door, a move investigators had already anticipated. Waiting officers intercepted him instantly. The moment was tense but swift. After years of running, the man who had reinvented himself countless times finally had nowhere left to go. When handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Mack didn't fight. He didn't shout. He simply stared ahead with an expression that unnerved even the officers, calculated, cold, and emotionless. The charming persona he had used to manipulate women for decades was gone. In its place stood a man, stripped of masks. His arrest became national news. For the victims who had lived in fear or felt ignored for years, this moment was vindication. Their stories were finally being heard. They were no longer isolated voices. They were the key to exposing a predator who had hidden in plain sight. The trial was equally revealing. In court, prosecutors laid out Mack's long, tangled history, his forged documents, shifting identities, and patterns of abuse and manipulation. Victims traveled from different states to testify. Some trembled as they described the psychological traps he built around them. Others spoke with steady voices, determined to ensure the world understood exactly who he was. Their testimonies created the portrait of a man who didn't just lie. He engineered lies. He built entire realities to control the people in his life. The courtroom listened as women described how he isolated them, manipulated their emotions, fabricated tragedies to gain sympathy, and when challenged, became threatening and violent. Fragmented police reports from different states were pieced together into a timeline that covered decades. Jurors saw how he reinvented himself again and again, leaving behind confusion, trauma, and shattered lives. They learned about the night his wife recognized him on America's Most Wanted, the phone call that reignited the investigation, and the evidence trail that finally trapped him. Through it all, Paul Stephen Mack remained disturbingly calm. He showed little remorse, rarely reacted to emotional testimonies, and often stared blankly at the floor or the wall. It was as if the trial wasn't about him at all, but about some character he had once played. In the end, the evidence was overwhelming. Mack was convicted and sentenced, ensuring he would never again walk free to manipulate, terrorize, or reinvent himself in another unsuspecting community. For the first time in his life, he faced consequences he couldn't charm or escape. The truth about his secret life was finally exposed. The trial brought closure to many victims, though the scars he left would never fully fade. Law enforcement agencies used the case as a powerful reminder of the importance of communication across states, a lesson carved out of years of oversight that let a predator roam unchecked. As for the woman who discovered his truth on television, she rebuilt her life with strength few could imagine. She had unknowingly married a fugitive, lived beside danger without realizing it, and ultimately made the courageous decision that ended his freedom. Paul Stephen Mack entered the justice system as a man who believed he could outrun truth forever. He left it as a man whose lies were finally impossible to hide.